Morning, everyone.
Good morning, Rabbi.
We're learning Mishna Rosh Hashanah, Perek Beis, Chapter 2, Mishnah Ches, Mishnah 8. So continuing with examining witnesses regarding their sighting of the new moon, the Mishnah says, the Mus Tzurais Levanois, Haile Rabbi Gamliel, Batabla Bakaisa Baliyasai. Rabbi Gamliel, who was the head of the Bezdin in his time, so he had different shapes of the moon on a table and on his wall in his aliyah, meaning on his upper floor. That with them he would show the hadyotis. That means the simple people who, if you'd ask them the questions that we mentioned before, they wouldn't be able to get it. So instead, what he did was he had these pictures, and he said to them, "Hakazera isa kazeh. Did you see this? Did you see that? Did you see the part of the moon that shines? Was it towards the sun or not?" Meaning, yeah, he had different pictures. He had different forms. And the different forms were forms of all the questions asked before. Which way was the moon facing? Which way was it? And all these things were pictures that he could say, okay, what did you see? And based on what they told him he saw, that's how they were able to examine whether their testimony was acceptable or not. Now the Mishnah continues with the following story. It happened that two witnesses came and said, we saw it in the morning in the east, and the evening in the west. That means is that these witnesses said, we saw the old moon in the morning in the east, the old moon in the morning in the east, and the new moon in the evening of the same day in the west. Because it's the way they explain it here is that at the end of a cycle, the moon appears in the east in the early morning, and at the beginning of a cycle, it appears in the west in the early evening. And these guys saw both. They saw both. Now, what they're saying about the old moon is really irrelevant. There's nothing to do. It's not part of their testimony. They didn't have to say it, but they said it. And they said that we saw the old moon in the east in the morning, and the new moon in the west in the evening. Rabbi Yochanan said, they are false witnesses. It is not possible to see them both in the same day. And then explain around the bottom, there is always at least 24 hours between the last appearance of the old moon and the first appearance of the new moon. During those 24 hours, the moon cannot be seen at all. Thus, witnesses who claim to have seen both the old and new moon in the same day must be lying. So again, the first half of the testimony was irrelevant. But once they said it, it comes out that they're lying. And once they're lying, we can't accept their testimony. Now, this happened let's call it this first part didn't happen in the high court. It happened somewhere else amongst other sages. Rabbi Yochanan said, these guys are liars. When they came to Yavna, which was where the Sanhedrin, the high court, was at the sides on the new moon, Kibla Rabbi Gamliel. Rabbi Gamliel accepted their testimony. He accepted it. Now, he can't accept it as the truth because it's impossible. So therefore, the way they explain it is like this. Rabbi Gamliel accepted their testimony regarding the new moon because that agreed with his astronomical calculations. The part about the new moon in the east seeing it made all the sense in the world. Because it made sense at this point of the year, according to his calculations, his astronomical calculations, there was no question that this could be true. So that half, there was nothing wrong with. As for the testimony regarding the old moon, Gamliel simply dismissed it, believing that they mistook a wisp of cloud for the new moon. Meaning, the first thing they say was the moon. It must have been a mistake. They must have seen a cloud, and it looked like the moon to them. So they said, we saw the moon also. But it wasn't the moon. So the second half makes sense. The second half was true. And the first half was a mistake. That's all. We don't have to. He didn't accept them as liars. He accepted the part of the testimony about the new moon because it made sense. It made sense to be true, and the first half was a mistake. Now that's Rabbi Gamliel. Rabbi Yochanan, who was the sage mentioned before, he said they're liars. Rabbi Yochanan, on the other hand, ruled that the testimony about the new moon was false because according to his calculations, should not have been invisible that evening. This is very interesting. When you read the Mishnah, and you read the Mishnah that Rabbi Yochanan said they're liars, right? So they're liars because you can't have both. But according to the way Rabbi Gamliel according to the way we explain Rabbi Gamliel, we now see Rabbi Yochanan said they're liars, not so much because of the fact, how can you see both of them together? Because Rabbi Gamliel took care of that problem by saying it was a cloud. But the real reason Rabbi Yochanan said they were false is because, according to his calculations, even what they said about the new moon can't be true. According to his calculations, this couldn't be true. And therefore, besides the fact that what they said seemed to have been a lie, but because of the two things that they said, but in essence, the point really that Rabbi Yochanan was making to say there were false witnesses is because even the second part, which could have been true, that they saw the new moon in the west, he said it couldn't be. Because according to his astronomical calculations, it just wasn't true. Okay, now we have another story about two witnesses who came and said, we saw the new moon in its time. As we've had before, when the Mishnah talks about the moon in its time, it means we saw it on the night of the 30th. That's when we saw it. That's the expected time. Ubelel iburai, but in the night of its ibur, of its fullness, which means that if you didn't see the new moon on the night of the 30th, but let's say you saw it on the 31st, that means the previous month was how many days? 30 days. That's called a full month. That's just what we call it. We call it a full month, even though it's not really the way it's supposed to be necessarily, but we call it a full month. So they said like this, Re'inu bizmanoi, we saw the new moon in its time on the night of the 30th. Ubelel iburai, but on the night of the 31st, loy nira, we couldn't see it anymore. And it wasn't because it got cloudy. And they saw the new moon the first night on the 30th, and then they said on the 31st, we didn't see it anymore. And again, it wasn't cloudy. There was no obvious reason to say we didn't see it because something was blocking it. So they said, okay, so we saw it on the 30th, not on the 31st. That's not too probable, right? If it was already there the 30th, it should be the 31st. Nonetheless, the Kibbutz Rabbi Gamliel still accepted it. Omer Rabbi Daisa ben Harkinas. So the sage Rabbi Daisa ben Harkinas said, "Hey, they're liars. Ha'ech me'idin al isha sheyolda. Is it possible to testify a woman who gave birth? And the next day she's still pregnant? Doesn't happen. So how can you say that it was out on the night of the 30th, but it wasn't there on the 31st? It went back, so to speak, into how it gets covered up, not seen anymore on the 31st. How can you do that? So basically, he said they were liars. Amar Rabbi Yeshua said to Rabbi Daisa ben Harkinas, Re'anis tevarecha. I see your words. I agree with you. Now, what did Rabbi Gamliel think? So again, they explained. Here, Rabbi Gamliel accepted that they saw the moon on the first night because that agreed with his calculations. That made sense. He dismissed their statement about the moon being invisible the following night because it might have been hidden by a cloud or was invisible for some other reason. He's still ready to say that if the second half, if the part of the testimony that's relevant to establishing the new moon, establishing a new month, if that makes sense, then we're going to accept that. And the part that doesn't make sense, so it doesn't mean they were lying. It was a mistake somehow. They assumed there was no cloud. Maybe it really was a cloud, or some other reason. That somehow or another you couldn't see it. But he was ready to dismiss that part and stick with the first part, and dismiss the second part and stick with the first part. And here it seems that this approach from Gamliel seems to have been less acceptable than the approach before, because we're going to see it turned into a whole business. But this one seems to have been, because he said in the first part, Rabbi Yeshua doesn't say, "Oh, I agree with the first sage." In the second case, we have Rabbi Daisa ben Harkinas, I Rabbi Gamliel. Yeshua says to him, "I agree with you, not Rabbi Gamliel." In the first case, we don't find anybody in Yavne arguing with Rabbi Gamliel. So apparently, that case where you see the moon, he said, "I saw the old one in the east and the new one in the west." that part, what Rabbi Gamliel explained it, seemed to have been acceptable. But this case, where it was out the 30th, and you couldn't see it on the 31st anymore, that already his explanation seemed to have been not as acceptable. Rabbi Deisa ben Arkinas got up and said that he disagrees, and Rabbi Yeshua agreed with him. So here it seems that his explanation was less acceptable. But again, what comes out at the end is that in this second case, you have the witness is saying we saw it on the night of the 30th, couldn't see it anymore on the 30th, didn't see it on the 31st. Gamliel was ready to accept that as accepting the first part that they saw it because it made sense. The second half must have been a mistake. Deisa ben Kina said, no way, these guys are lying. And Rabbi Yeshua agreed to it. And the next Mishnah will be a continuation of this episode. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Rabbi.